The fluorescent lights of West Side High's hallway flickered mercilessly as Mark Sullivan pressed himself against the wall, trying to become one with the dented metal lockers. At 17, he had mastered the art of taking up less space, despite his 315-pound frame. His eyes fixed on the cracked linoleum floor, counting the black and white squares. Anything to avoid eye contact with the stream of students flooding past him. "Yo, Massive Mark! Earthquake warning!" Kyle Jenkins' voice cut through the hallway chatter, followed by the predictable chorus of laughter. Mark clutched his sketchbook tighter, the only shield he had against their words. Inside those pages lived a world where he wasn't defined by his size. Intricate comic book heroes with perfect proportions and cityscapes where he could disappear among the buildings. Just 30 more days, he whispered to himself. 30 more days until graduation, until he could leave behind the prison that West Side High had become. New York in 2003 was a city rebuilding itself, finding its identity again after tragedy. Mark felt stuck in his own reconstruction project, one that seemed impossible to complete. He shuffled into Mr. Abernathy's art class, the only 60 minutes of his day that didn't feel like torture. The classroom smelled of acrylic paint and possibility. "These portfolio submissions are due next Friday," Mr. Abernathy announced, sliding a flyer across Mark's desk. "Cooper Union's summer program. Your work deserves to be seen, Mark." Mark nodded politely, but inside, panic bloomed. Being seen was exactly what he'd spent years avoiding. His talent was the one thing untainted by his weight. What if they rejected that too? That afternoon, Mark's routine played out with familiar precision. Headphones on, hood up, taking the long way home through Washington Square Park to avoid Kyle and his friends, who usually hung out on 6th Avenue. The early spring air carried the scent of food carts and promise, a promise that never seemed meant for him. His apartment building on Avenue B stood as a testament to a changing neighborhood, half gentrified, half holding on to its gritty past. Mark took the stairs despite the protest of his knees, a daily penance for existing in a body he hated. "Mark, is that you?" Mrs. Chen called from 4B as he reached his floor. "I made too many dumplings again. Such a shame to waste food." Mark knew this was no accident. Ever since his mother started picking up night shifts at the hospital, Mrs. Chen had appointed herself his unofficial guardian. Her husband, a retired baker, watched from their doorway with knowing eyes. "Thank you, but I'm not hungry," Mark lied, the words familiar on his tongue. "Not about hunger," Mr. Chen spoke up, his accent thick, but his meaning clear. "About connection. Food brings people together." Mark accepted the container reluctantly, another act in the performance of normalcy. Inside his family's apartment, the silence greeted him like an old friend. His mother wouldn't be home until after midnight, and his father, well, he'd stopped wondering where his father was years ago. He placed the dumplings in the refrigerator and headed straight to his room, shedding his oversized hoodie to reveal damp patches of sweat underneath. His bedroom walls were covered with his artwork, fantastical versions of New York, where the buildings bent like waves and the streets flowed like rivers. A world more forgiving than the one outside his window. The spring formal poster he'd designed hung above his desk, a cruel irony. He'd created the artwork anonymously through Mr. Abernathy, unable to bear the thought of people knowing that the fat kid had designed something beautiful. Mark opened his laptop, a graduation gift from his mother who'd worked double shifts for months to afford it, and logged onto the forum where he posted his digital art under the username Brooklyn Visionary. Online, nobody knew about his double chin or the way his thighs chafed when he walked. Online, he was just his art. A notification popped up. Gallery Girl 98 had commented on his latest piece. "This perspective is incredible. The way you capture NYC's energy without showing a single person. It's like beautiful loneliness." Beautiful loneliness. She had unknowingly described his entire existence. His phone buzzed with a text from his mother. "Working late again. Leftovers in fridge. Love you." Mark sighed and opened his sketchbook instead of replying. His pencil moved across the page, creating a self-portrait where his face was clear and defined, not hidden beneath layers of fat, a version of himself that existed only in his imagination. The next morning, Mark woke before his alarm, his stomach growling in protest. He'd skipped dinner again, part of his endless cycle of starvation, followed by shameful midnight binges. Today would be different, he promised himself, the same promise he made every morning. The school day dragged until lunch period, when Mark hid in the library as usual, sketching instead of eating. He didn't notice Sarah Williams sit down across from him until she spoke. "That's really good," she said, her voice startling him into a jagged line across the page. Sarah wasn't popular, but she existed in that comfortable middle ground of high school hierarchy, pretty enough to be noticed, smart enough to be respected, and kind enough to be well-liked. Mark had shared 3 classes with her since freshman year, but they'd never had a real conversation. "Thanks," he mumbled, closing his sketchbook protectively. "You're designing the yearbook cover, right? Mr. Abernathy showed me your draft. It's amazing." Mark's face burned. Another secret identity revealed. "It's not final or anything." "Well, it should be," she smiled, tucking her dark hair behind her ear. "Are you going to the spring formal?" The question hit like a physical blow. Was she mocking him? Who would expect someone like him at a dance? "I don't do dances," he said flatly. "That's too bad. The decorations committee could use someone with your eye." Before Mark could respond, the library door burst open and Kyle sauntered in with his friends. His eyes locked on Mark with predatory precision. "Look at this, Beauty and the Beast having a moment," Kyle announced, loud enough to earn a glare from the librarian. Sarah rolled her eyes. "Grow up, Kyle. Just wondering what diet advice you're giving him. Obviously nothing's working." Kyle snickered, high-fiving his friend Derek. Mark gathered his things, humiliation burning hotter than anger. This was why he didn't talk to people, why he didn't put himself out there. Every interaction was just an opportunity for more pain. As he pushed past Kyle toward the door, Kyle stuck out his foot. Mark's momentum carried him forward, his large body crashing to the floor with a thud that seemed to echo through the silent library. His sketchbook slid across the polished floor, pages spilling open for everyone to see. This moment, sprawled on the cold floor, artwork exposed, laughter raining down, would become the catalyst that changed everything. Mark didn't know it yet as he gathered his scattered drawings with trembling hands, but this was the last day he would try to disappear. The spring formal transformed the Westside High Gymnasium into an unrecognizable space of twinkling lights and silver streamers, but Mark recognized the same old hierarchies at play. He hadn't planned to come, had sworn he wouldn't, yet here he stood in the darkest corner, wearing the only dress shirt that fit him properly, a camera hanging around his neck. Mr. Abernathy had offered him $50 to photograph the event for the yearbook, and Mark's need for art supplies had overcome his dread. Through his camera lens, he observed rather than participated, capturing moments that would become nostalgic memories for everyone but him. Kyle and his girlfriend Madison dancing close, basketball players performing ridiculous moves that somehow looked cool, teachers pretending not to notice students sneaking outside. "You actually came." Sarah appeared beside him, wearing a simple blue dress that made her eyes seem brighter. Mark lowered his camera. "Working," he clarified, pointing to the equipment. "Still counts as showing up." She glanced at the dance floor. "Got any good shots?" "A few." He scrolled through the digital display to show her, surprised at how easy it felt to talk about photography instead of himself. "These are really good. You see things differently." She studied one particular image of 2 girls laughing, their faces caught in a moment of genuine joy. Like you're capturing what people actually feel, not just how they pose. For a fleeting moment, Mark felt something dangerous, pride. He quickly suppressed it. "Want to get some air?" Sarah asked. "It's suffocating in here." Outside, the April night carried a hint of warmth, promising a summer that felt impossibly distant. They sat on the steps behind the gym, the muffled music creating a soundtrack to their unexpected conversation. "Why are you being nice to me?" Mark finally asked, the question that had been bothering him since the library. Sarah looked genuinely surprised. "Do I need a reason? People usually do." She considered this, picking at a loose thread on her dress. "My brother was heavy in high school. The things people said to him." She trailed off. "He's at Cornell now, and sometimes I still see him check nutrition labels like they're going to attack him. It never really leaves you, I guess." Mark didn't know how to respond to her honesty. "But that's not why I'm talking to you," she continued. "Your art is incredible. You see beauty in everything except yourself." The door behind them opened, releasing a blast of music and laughter. Kyle and two of his friends stumbled out, Madison trailing behind them. "Yo, it's the photographer!" Kyle's voice had the loose quality of someone who'd been drinking. "Get my good side, fatso." He struck a ridiculous pose. Mark tensed but continued adjusting his camera settings, determined to ignore them. "I'm talking to you," Kyle insisted, moving closer. The smell of smuggled vodka permeated the air around him. "Don't you want a picture of the king and queen?" "Leave him alone, Kyle," Sarah said, standing up. "Oh, defending your boyfriend? What, do you have a fetish or something?" Madison tugged at Kyle's arm. "Come on, let's go back inside." "No, I want my picture." Kyle grabbed Mark's camera, yanking it upward. The strap dug into Mark's neck before snapping with a decisive tear. Time seemed to slow as the camera, his mother's Christmas gift, purchased with overtime hours, tumbled to the concrete steps and shattered. Something broke inside Mark, too. 17 years of containment, of shrinking himself despite his size, of swallowing rage and shame until they became part of his cellular structure. It all erupted in a single fluid motion. His fist connected with Kyle's perfect jawline before he even registered the decision to swing. Kyle staggered backward, more shocked than hurt. His friend surged forward, grabbing Mark's arms while Kyle regained his balance. The first punch to Mark's stomach forced the air from his lungs. The second split his lip. He tasted blood and humiliation as he sank to his knees. "Not so tough now, huh?" Kyle spat, shaking out his hand. "Come on, guys." They left Mark there, broken camera pieces scattered around him like evidence of a crime. Sarah knelt beside him, offering tissues from her purse for his bleeding lip. "We should tell someone," she insisted. "And say what? The fat kid finally stood up for himself and got beat down anyway?" Mark gathered the camera fragments with shaking hands. "Story of my life. This isn't right, Mark. Nothing's right. Nothing's ever been right." He stood up, wobbling slightly. "I'm going home. Let me help you." "I don't need help." The words came out sharper than intended. "I need to not be this person anymore." The walk home stretched endlessly through streets that seemed to mock him with their vibrancy. New York on a Friday night was alive with possibilities that felt galaxies away from his reach. When he finally reached his apartment building, he avoided the elevator where he might encounter neighbors, taking the stairs despite the pain from his bruised ribs. His mother was home for once, sitting at the kitchen table in scrubs, sorting bills into piles. "You're back early," she said without looking up. "Didn't you have that dance?" Her words stopped abruptly when she saw his face. "What happened?" "Nothing," Mark mumbled, but the broken camera in his hands betrayed him. His mother's exhaustion gave way to a flash of the fierce protectiveness he remembered from childhood. "Who did this to you?" "It doesn't matter." "Of course it matters. I'm calling the school." "No!" Mark's voice cracked. "That will make everything worse. Please!" She approached him slowly, as if he were a wounded animal. "Honey, this has to stop. You can't keep letting people hurt you." "You think I'm letting this happen?" The injustice of her words stung worse than his split lip. "You think I want to be this?" He gestured at his body with disgust, tears threatening to spill over. His mother reached for him, but he backed away. "I didn't mean—" "I know what you meant. You meant I should stand up for myself, be confident, love myself no matter what." The bitterness in his voice surprised even him. "But you don't get it. Nobody gets it. I can't love this." I can't live in this body anymore. He retreated to his room, locking the door against her concerned knocking. Inside, he faced the mirror he usually avoided, forcing himself to really look. His lip was swollen, a small cut glistening red against pale skin. His eyes, the same clear blue as his absent father's, seemed to belong to someone else. Someone trapped inside this flesh prison he called a body. Mark took out his sketchbook and began to draw with furious energy. Not fantastical cityscapes or comic book heroes, but himself. Page after page of self-portraits, each one stripping away layers until the final drawing showed a version of Mark that existed only in potential. Strong, defined, confident. He tore out this last drawing and pinned it to his wall. This would be his blueprint, his target, his obsession. The broken camera on his desk reminded him of everything that had been taken from him: dignity, confidence, normalcy. But unlike the camera, Mark could be rebuilt. He opened his laptop and began researching with the same intensity he usually reserved for his art: nutrition, exercise, psychology. He was done being a victim, done being massive Mark. That night, he slept dreamlessly for the first time in years, his body heavy with exhaustion, but his mind strangely clear. In the morning, he woke before dawn and stood at his window, watching the city slowly illuminate. New York was a place of reinvention, of second acts and redemption stories. It was time for his to begin. Summer in New York City transformed the concrete landscape into a sweltering urban oven, but Mark barely noticed the heat. 6 weeks into his self-imposed metamorphosis, every day followed the same punishing routine. Pre-dawn runs along the East River, protein-heavy breakfasts prepared under Mr. Chen's watchful guidance, afternoons split between his summer job at the local art supply store and the community center gym, evenings spent researching nutrition and sketching his progress. By July, he had lost 37 pounds. The number on the scale became both his tormentor and salvation, a daily judgment that determined his worth. Some mornings, standing on the bathroom scale felt like standing before a firing squad. Other days, it offered absolution for his existence. "You're pushing too hard," Mr. Chen commented one morning as Mark prepared egg whites in the Chen's kitchen. Since that first night when Mark had knocked on their door asking for cooking lessons, their apartment had become his sanctuary, especially on the nights his mother worked doubles. "I'm fine," Mark insisted, measuring his food with scientific precision. "Body needs rest to heal. Mine too." Mr. Chen placed a hand on Mark's shoulder, feeling the bones that had begun to emerge from hiding. "What are you running from, young artist?" Mark avoided the older man's perceptive gaze. "I'm not running from anything. I'm running towards something." "Ah," Mr. Chen nodded sagely. "Important difference. But destination same either way." These philosophical exchanges had become part of Mark's education, lessons that extended beyond proper knife techniques and the balance of flavors. Mr. Chen spoke of food as nourishment rather than enemy, of balance rather than restriction. These concepts remained foreign to Mark, who had developed a militant relationship with eating. The art supply store job had been Sarah's suggestion. She'd appeared at his door 3 days after the spring formal disaster, somehow having obtained his address. "Artscape on 7th Avenue is hiring," she'd said without preamble. "The owner's my mom's friend. They need someone who knows about drawing supplies." Mark had been too surprised to do anything but accept the job application she thrust at him. Now, arranging precision pens and testing paper stock for customers occupied his afternoons, providing both income for his growing collection of workout equipment and a connection to the art world he'd nearly abandoned in his obsession with transformation. Sarah stopped by occasionally, always under the pretense of needing supplies for her photography hobby. They developed a cautious friendship built on shared creative interests and carefully avoided topics: his weight loss, that night at the dance, Kyle, until one sweltering July afternoon when Sarah walked into Artscape looking uncharacteristically somber. "Have you heard?" she asked, leaning against the counter where Mark was inventorying charcoal pencils. "Heard what?" "About Kyle. He wrapped his car around a tree last night. He's in the hospital. Mark's pencil paused above the inventory sheet. He searched his emotions for the appropriate response and found a complicated tangle. He'll live. Broken leg. Concussion. His basketball scholarship is probably toast. She studied Mark's expression. You don't have to pretend you're sorry. I'm not pretending anything, he resumed, counting pencils. I don't want him dead. I just want him irrelevant. Sarah nodded, understanding in her eyes. You look different. It was the first time she'd acknowledged his changing appearance. Mark felt oddly vulnerable, more exposed by this observation than when he'd been at his heaviest. I feel different, he admitted. Good different? He considered the question seriously. Stronger, but not happier yet. Does that make sense? More than you know. She picked up a sketchbook, flipping through its blank pages. My brother says it took him years to stop feeling like the fat kid, even after he wasn't anymore. Mark had been avoiding his reflection lately, finding it disorienting to see a stranger looking back at him. His clothes hung loosely now, his face emerging from what had felt like layers of disguise. Sometimes he caught glimpses of his father in his more defined jawline, a disturbing revelation. I got into the Cooper Union summer workshop, he said, changing the subject. It starts next week. Sarah's face brightened. That's amazing. I knew you would. I almost didn't apply. After the camera incident, he trailed off. But you did anyway. That's what matters. The Cooper Union workshop became Mark's introduction to a world where people saw his art before they saw him. The instructor, Ms. Delgado, pushed him to explore themes beyond his comfort zone of architectural precision. Your technical skills are impressive, she told him after class one day, but you're holding back emotionally. Art isn't just about rendering reality, it's about interpreting it through your unique perspective. That evening, Mark stood before his bathroom mirror, really looking at himself for the first time in months. His body told a story of transformation, loose skin around his middle, emerging collarbones, thinner face. But his eyes held the same uncertainty, the same question. Was this enough? Would he ever be enough? He took out his sketchbook and began to draw himself as he was now, not idealized, not disguised, but real. Halfway through, his hand began to shake, and he realized he was crying. The release felt foreign after months of rigid control. The next day at the workshop, he brought this self-portrait, vulnerable, honest, unfinished. Ms. Delgado studied it silently, then looked up at him with recognition in her eyes. Now you're making art. August brought a heat wave that seemed to melt the city's edges, blurring boundaries between neighborhoods and social strata. Mark had lost nearly 60 pounds by now, his body responding to his disciplined assault with remarkable efficiency. His mother watched his transformation with a mixture of pride and concern, leaving nutrition articles on the kitchen counter alongside college brochures. NYU has an excellent art program, she mentioned one rare evening when they were both home for dinner. And you could live here, save on housing costs. Mark pushed salad around his plate, calculating calories. I was thinking about applying to schools in California. Then the hurt that flashed across his mother's face was quickly masked with a smile. That's ambitious. Good for you. I need a fresh start, he explained. Somewhere no one knows me. You mean somewhere no one knows who you were, she corrected gently. But honey, you'll always be you, no matter what state you live in or what size jeans you wear. Mark didn't respond. He wasn't ready to accept that the Mark who had been humiliated and beaten, who had swallowed shame with every meal, who had tried to disappear despite his size, that this person would always be part of him. The last week of summer, Mark received an email that shattered his carefully constructed routine, an invitation to Sarah's birthday party. A small gathering, the message said, just a few friends from school and the art community. Nothing fancy. His instinct was to decline immediately. Social situations still triggered anxiety, memories of mockery and exclusion too fresh, despite his physical changes. But Ms. Delgado's words echoed in his mind. He was holding back emotionally, hiding behind his controlled exterior just as effectively as he had once hidden behind his weight. With trembling fingers, he typed, "I'll be there." The night of the party, Mark stood outside Sarah's apartment building in Gramercy, wearing new clothes that actually fit his transformed body. At 218 pounds, he was still large, but no longer obese. A distinction that felt monumental to him, but might be invisible to people who hadn't seen him in months. His finger hovered over the buzzer when the door swung open and a laughing couple emerged. Mark caught the door before it closed and slipped inside, taking the stairs to delay his arrival. Music and conversation spilled from Sarah's apartment on the third floor. He stood outside, gathering courage. The door opened before he could knock. Sarah stood there in a green dress, camera in hand. "I saw you from the window," she explained. "I was worried you might bail." Mark managed a small smile. "I considered it." She studied him openly, taking in the changes. "You look good, Mark. Healthy. Thanks." The word came out stiffly. Compliments remained unfamiliar territory. Inside, about 15 people clustered in small groups throughout the apartment. Mark recognized a few faces from West Side High and others from the Cooper Union workshop. No one seemed to recognize him at first, which brought both relief and a strange disappointment. "Mark! Holy shit, is that you?" The voice belonged to Derek, Kyle's former wingman, clutching a beer by the window. "Dude, you're like half the size." Mark tensed, preparing for the familiar mockery, but Derek's expression held something unexpected. Respect. "Yeah, it's me," Mark acknowledged, accepting the soda Sarah pressed into his hand. "That's wild, man. Good for you." Derek seemed genuinely impressed. "Kyle's not gonna believe it." The mention of Kyle sent a cold spike through Mark's carefully maintained composure. "Is he here?" "Nah, still doing physical therapy for his leg. He's supposed to start community college next week." Derek lowered his voice. "Between us, he's kind of a mess these days. Lost his scholarship, his girlfriend. Karma's a bitch, right?" Mark should have felt satisfaction at Kyle's downfall, but the emotion that surfaced was more complex. "Right," he said non-committally, moving away to examine Sarah's photography displayed on the walls. The evening progressed with surprising ease. Mark found himself discussing art techniques with Cooper Union peers, even laughing at inside jokes about their demanding instructor. No one treated him like an outsider, like the person he had been. Near midnight, he stepped onto the small balcony for air and found Sarah already there, photographing the city lights. "Having fun?" she asked without lowering her camera. "Actually, yes." The realization surprised him. "Thanks for inviting me." She turned to face him, her expression serious in the dim light. "Can I ask you something personal?" Mark nodded, though wariness crept up his spine. "Are you happier now? After all this?" She gestured vaguely at his transformed body. The question pierced through the carefully constructed narrative he'd been telling himself. Was he happier? He was certainly stronger, more disciplined, less limited physically, but happiness remained elusive, a destination that kept moving as he approached it. He began, searching for honesty. "I'm less afraid of being seen, of taking up space. That's not exactly happiness, but it's something." Sarah nodded, as if he'd confirmed a theory. "My brother says the same thing. He calls it conditional existing, like you're finally allowed to participate in life, but only because you've paid some entry fee." Mark felt exposed, seen in a way that was both uncomfortable and necessary. "So what's the alternative? Just accept being miserable?" "No." Sarah leaned against the railing, city lights illuminating her profile. "The alternative is realizing that the condition was never real, that you were always allowed to exist, to be seen, to matter." Inside, someone called Sarah's name, announcing it was time for cake. She touched Mark's arm lightly. "Coming?" "In a minute." Alone on the balcony, Mark looked out at the Manhattan skyline, the same city that had witnessed his humiliation and his transformation. The night air carried the endless possibility that had drawn generations of reinventors to this island. For the first time, Mark wondered if reinvention was truly about becoming someone new, or if it was about finally becoming who you already were beneath the layers of fear and shame. He didn't have the answer yet, but asking the question felt like progress. When he returned inside, someone handed him a piece of cake without comment, as if he were just another guest, just another normal person enjoying a celebration. He took a bite without calculating calories, without self-recrimination, a small act of rebellion against the rigid rules that had governed his summer. It tasted like possibility. The crisp October air carried the scent of possibility as Mark stood outside Westside High, now a visitor rather than a prisoner. 3 months into his freshman year at NYU's Tisch School of the Arts, he had returned to his old high school for an unlikely reason: to speak to the current art students about his growing success as an illustrator. At 205 pounds, Mark had finally reached a place of truce with his body. The weight loss had slowed, then stabilized, his frame finding its natural set point after the dramatic transformation of the previous year. More important than the number on the scale was the shift in his center of gravity. He moved through the world with a quiet confidence that came from surviving his own personal war. "Nervous?" Sarah asked, walking beside him toward the entrance. Now, roommates with his mother's blessing, they shared an affordable apartment in Alphabet City where Sarah pursued photography while attending City College, and Mark balanced his art studies with growing freelance work. "A little," he admitted. "Last time I was here wasn't exactly a highlight reel." "You don't have to do this," she reminded him. "Mr. Abernathy would understand." Mark shook his head. "I want to. Maybe there's some kid in there who needs to hear that things can change." The hallways felt simultaneously familiar and foreign, like returning to a childhood home that had been renovated. Same bones, different atmosphere. Students passed without a second glance, not recognizing the former massive Mark in this composed art student with fashionable glasses and a portfolio case. Mr. Abernathy greeted them outside the art room, his smile wide and genuine. "There he is, our rising star." The exuberant welcome made Mark uncomfortable, but he returned the smile. His former teacher had been instrumental in connecting him with a small comic publisher that had picked up his urban fantasy series, a growing success that had garnered attention from larger publishing houses. Inside, 20 students looked up with mild curiosity as Mr. Abernathy introduced him as a West Side alum making waves in the illustration world. Mark scanned their faces, recognizing the familiar high school taxonomy, the confident ones in front, the dreamers by the windows, the invisible ones trying to disappear in the back corners. He had been that last type, once upon a time. "So, I graduated last year," Mark began awkwardly, setting up his portfolio on the display easel. "Now I'm studying at NYU and working on a comic series called Invisible Cities. It's about—" He paused, suddenly struck by the absurdity of explaining his art to strangers when he'd never really explained it to himself. His comic series, urban landscapes that transformed into living entities, reflecting the emotions of the characters who inhabited them, had begun as therapy, a way to process his complicated relationship with New York and his own body. "It's about feeling alien in familiar places," he continued with newfound clarity. "About how the same city can feel completely different depending on who you are when you walk through it." A girl in the back row looked up from her sketchbook, sudden interest in her eyes. Mark recognized that look, the realization that someone else had articulated something you thought was yours alone. As Mark showed his work and answered questions, he felt a strange doubling of perspective, simultaneously his present self and the ghost of who he had been a year before, sitting in these same chairs, dreaming of escape. The session ended with enthusiastic applause and students crowding around to see his original sketches. The girl from the back approached last, hanging back until the others had dispersed. "Your work is really good," she said quietly, hugging her sketchbook to her chest. She was heavy, with the familiar defensive posture Mark recognized from years of his own mirror reflections. I especially like how the buildings change based on the character's emotions. Thanks, Mark replied, really looking at her. Do you draw too? She nodded, clutching her sketchbook tighter. Can I see? The girl hesitated, then slowly opened her book to reveal intricate drawings, people whose physical forms shifted like liquid, their bodies expressing inner states rather than fixed reality. These are amazing, Mark said with genuine admiration. You have a unique perspective. Her surprise at the compliment was painfully familiar. Really? Really? Keep developing this style. It's saying something important. After she left, Sarah squeezed his arm. You just made her day. I know exactly how she feels, Mark said softly. Invisible but desperate to be seen, just not for the wrong reasons. They walked through the main hallway toward the exit, passing the gymnasium where the spring formal disaster had occurred. Mark paused, looking at the closed double doors. Want to peek inside? Sarah asked, understanding without explanation. Mark shook his head. No need. Just saying goodbye to something. Outside, in the school parking lot, a figure leaning on a cane caught Mark's attention. Kyle Jenkins, talking to the basketball coach. He looked different. Thinner, less imposing, his former swagger replaced by a careful, measured movement as he demonstrated something with his hands. Mark froze, unprepared for this encounter. Part of him wanted to disappear, the old instinct for self-preservation kicking in. Another part wanted Kyle to see him, to witness his transformation, to feel some regret for the torment he'd inflicted. Before Mark could decide on a course of action, Kyle looked up, and their eyes met across the parking lot. Recognition dawned slowly on Kyle's face, confusion giving way to disbelief. Sullivan, Kyle called, his voice lacking its former aggressive edge. Mark nodded, standing his ground as Kyle made his way over, each step with the cane deliberate and careful. Holy shit, Kyle said, taking in Mark's transformed appearance. You look different. So do you, Mark replied neutrally, noting the shadows under Kyle's eyes, the slight hollowness to his cheeks. An awkward silence stretched between them, years of tormentor and tormented dynamics impossible to ignore, yet difficult to acknowledge. I heard you're at NYU now, Kyle finally said. Art school, right? Mark nodded again, wondering how Kyle knew this information, why he would care. That's cool. I'm at BMCC, Kyle continued, referring to the borough of Manhattan Community College. Studying physical therapy, actually. Kind of found my calling after the accident. The surreal nature of this civil conversation with his former bully made Mark's head spin. Where was the arrogance, the cruelty that had defined Kyle in his memory? Listen, Kyle said, lowering his voice. I was a total asshole to you. To a lot of people, but especially you. He shifted uncomfortably. I know an apology doesn't fix anything. It doesn't, Mark interrupted, surprising himself with his directness. You made my life hell for years. Kyle nodded, accepting the bluntness. Yeah, I did. He looked down at his cane. Karma's a bitch, I guess. This isn't karma, Mark said, gesturing to Kyle's injured leg. And my weight loss isn't some victory over you. We're just different people now. The simplicity of this truth settled between them. Not forgiveness exactly, but acknowledgement that they had both been transformed by circumstances partly within and partly beyond their control. Anyway, Kyle said after another awkward pause, good for you, man, seriously. As Kyle limped away, Sarah rejoined Mark, having given them space for the exchange. You okay? Mark watched Kyle's retreating figure, searching his feelings for the satisfaction or vindication he had once imagined feeling in this scenario. Instead, he found something more complex, a quiet understanding that transcendence came not from confrontation or revenge, but from moving beyond the narratives that had once defined him. Yeah, he said, surprised to find it was true. I'm okay. That evening, Mark stood on the rooftop of his apartment building, watching the sunset paint Manhattan's skyline in warm gold. The city stretched before him. The same streets he had walked in shame and isolation now held possibility and connection. The same buildings that had once seemed like places to hide now represented opportunities to explore. His phone buzzed with a text from his editor. "Pitch for next arc approved. Contract coming tomorrow." Mark smiled, tucking the phone away. Success tasted sweeter than he had imagined, not because it proved anything to those who had doubted him, but because it validated the voice inside that had always whispered he was more than his appearance. Sarah joined him on the roof, camera in hand as always. "Capture something good?" he asked as she reviewed her shots. "Maybe." She turned the camera to show him a photo she'd taken earlier that day, Mark talking with the young artist at Westside, both of them looking down at her sketchbook, genuine engagement visible in their expressions. "You don't see yourself like others do," Sarah commented. "Even now." Mark studied the image, the confident set of his shoulders, the passionate focus as he discussed art. No trace of the self-consciousness that had once dominated his every interaction. "I'm getting there," he said. Below them, New York pulsed with 8 million stories of transformation, each person carrying their before and after within them. Mark had once believed that becoming unrecognizable was the ultimate goal, to shed himself completely and emerge as someone new. Now he understood that true metamorphosis wasn't about erasing the past, but integrating it, acknowledging that the frightened, creative boy who had hidden behind his sketchbooks was as much a part of him as the emerging artist he was becoming. He would always be the fat kid who had been bullied, and also the person who had survived it. He would always carry the memory of shame, and also the knowledge that he had transformed it into compassion. These contradictions weren't weaknesses, but the very essence of his strength, the ability to hold multiple truths simultaneously and still move forward. As darkness fell over the city, Mark opened his sketchbook and began to draw, not an idealized version of himself or an architectural fantasy, but the complex reality of his life as it existed now, imperfect, evolving, authentic. The page filled with images. Mr. Chen teaching him to chop vegetables with precision and patience. His mother hanging his first published comic cover on their refrigerator. Sarah photographing strangers with empathy and insight. The young artist at Westside discovering her voice. Even Kyle, learning to rebuild his body after loss. And at the center, Mark himself, not defined by pounds lost or gained, but by connections forged and courage discovered. This was his true transformation, more meaningful than any physical change, the ability to see beauty in complexity, to find strength in vulnerability, to recognize himself not as before or after, but as continuous and ever-evolving. The story wasn't about becoming unrecognizable, it was about finally recognizing himself.